Tim McGraw stepped onto the set of the Kelly Clarkson show to the sound of roaring applause, his trademark black cowboy hat tilted just right. Boots polished to a mirror shine, and a denim jacket that somehow looked both rugged and perfectly tailored. Kelly stood to greet him with her usual warmth, meeting him halfway for a quick hug before guiding him to the couch. The energy in the room was bright, the audience buzzing to see two country music powerhouses in the same space. At first, the conversation followed the comfortable, familiar rhythm of a daytime talk show, playful stories about life on the road. A few laughs over the unpredictable moments that come with performing live, and some heartfelt reflection on how both of them had navigated decades in the music industry. Kelly beamed as Tim spoke about his latest album, nodding enthusiastically and chiming in with supportive comments. But as the segment went on, Kelly glanced down at her cue cards, hesitating just a fraction of a second before launching a question that seemed to shift the air. "So, Tim, you've always been known for speaking your mind, even when it stirs the pot a little," she said with a teasing smile. "I think that's one of the reasons your fans love you, but it's also why you've made some headlines. Lately, how do you decide what's worth saying and what might, well, ruffle some feathers?" The audience chuckled softly, leaning in. Tim gave a small, knowing smile, adjusting his hat. "I say what's true," he replied, "and if that makes someone uncomfortable, maybe they needed to hear it." Kelly laughed politely, but there was a flicker of curiosity in her eyes, the kind that can easily turn into challenge. "Even if it's someone close to you?" she asked, her tone still light, but just sharp enough to make the audience go. Tim tilted his head slightly, his smile tightening. "Especially if it's someone close," he said. It was an answer that landed heavier than the earlier banter, and though the crowd laughed and clapped, a subtle thread of tension had begun to weave itself into the conversation. Kelly shifted in her seat, sensing the opening for a deeper exchange and maybe, without realizing it yet, setting the stage for the moment when the good-natured interview would start to feel a lot less friendly. Kelly's laugh this time was softer, more tentative, like she was weighing the tone of her next words. "Oh, that's bold," she said, leaning slightly toward him. "But you know, speaking your mind can get tricky when it's about people you care about. I mean, there have been a couple of interviews recently where folks thought you were throwing a little shade, even at friends." The audience reacted with a mix of light chuckles and murmurs, clearly aware of the headlines she was hinting at. Tim's expression didn't falter, but the way he adjusted the brim of his hat again betrayed that he'd heard the subtext loud and clear. "If people see shade where there's just honesty, that's on them," he said plainly. Kelly smiled but pressed a little harder, her voice still coated in honey. "But sometimes honesty stings, right? Even if you don't mean it to. Like that comment about, well, you know what I'm talking about." The audience leaned forward, sensing they were approaching something juicier. Tim raised his brows, a faint smirk forming. "You mean when I told the truth?" Kelly laughed with the crowd, but there was a flicker of tension in her eyes now. "Let's call it your version of the truth," she countered. That earned another round of O's from the audience, and Tim shifted in his seat, squaring his shoulders toward her. "Truth doesn't have versions," he said, his voice still even but carrying a new firmness. The shift was subtle, but the audience felt it. The clapping that followed was hesitant, almost as if they weren't sure whether to cheer or brace. For impact, Kelly, sensing the undercurrent, but perhaps misreading it as an opening, leaned in with a half smile. "Okay, so when you say things like that and it ends up hurting someone, do you ever regret it?" Tim's eyes held hers for a beat too long before he answered. "I regret when people twist what I say," he replied, not the saying of it. The weight in his tone hung in the air, and for a moment, the only sound was the faint shifting of audience members in their seats. From the wings, a producer made a small wrap-it-up motion, but Kelly ignored it, perhaps convinced she was about to get the kind of unfiltered TV moment hosts dream of. What she didn't realize was that Tim's patience was already starting to stretch thin, and that every extra nudge was bringing them closer to an exchange neither of them would forget. The air between them was no longer just charged, it was dense, carrying the weight of two people who had stepped quietly into a power struggle in front of a live audience. Kelly, still smiling, adjusted her cue cards and tilted her head. "You know, Tim, You've been in this business a long time, she began, her voice dipping into a slightly more deliberate rhythm. And you've seen how words can take on a life of their own? When you make strong statements, especially about other artists or the industry, you have to know it's going to stir things up. So why keep doing it if you know it might hurt someone? The audience murmured in anticipation, picking up on the faint sting in her question. Tim leaned back slightly, resting one arm across the back of the couch, his smile now more guarded. Because truth isn't supposed to be comfortable, he said. The answer was met with a mix of applause and low sounds from the crowd, the kind of reaction that acknowledged the tension as much as the sentiment. Kelly, perhaps emboldened by the reaction, pushed further. But don't you think there's a difference between truth and tact? Like, sometimes how you say something matters as much as what you're saying. Tim chuckled, not warmly, but the short, dry kind of laugh that suggested he'd heard this argument before. Sometimes people use tact as an excuse to avoid saying what needs to be said, he countered. The audience oohed again, their eyes bouncing between the two like spectators at a tennis match. Kelly's smile tightened. And sometimes people use truth as an excuse to be hurtful, she said, her voice still calm but with a sharper edge. The crowd reacted audibly now, a ripple of gasps and murmurs cutting through the room. Tim's jaw flexed subtly, his gaze steady on her. If someone feels hurt by the truth, maybe they need to ask themselves why it hurts, he said, his tone low but carrying. For a beat, the two simply stared at each other, the audience holding its collective breath. Even the co-host, who had been quiet until now, shifted uneasily, glancing toward the wings as if to signal for intervention. But the control room seemed to sense the moment was too charged to cut away from, and so the camera stayed fixed, capturing every flicker of expression as the conversation crept past the safety zone of daytime TV and into territory that felt personal, raw, and ready to combust. The studio lights seemed brighter now, almost harsh, as if the set itself had shifted from a friendly living room to a stage for a showdown. Kelly leaned forward, her smile gone, replaced with an expression that was part disbelief, part challenge. So you're saying, if someone feels hurt, that's their problem? Even if it's someone who's been in your corner? She asked, her voice steady, but sharpened by a tone that made the audience stir. Tim didn't blink. I'm saying if I speak the truth, I can't control how someone takes it. He replied, his words deliberate, his posture unshaken. The audience reacted again, a low hum of divided sentiment rolling through the rows. Kelly let out a short, incredulous laugh, shaking her head slightly. That's a pretty cold way to look at it, she said. Tim's voice dropped, just a notch lower, the subtle southern drawl in his tone, now carrying a harder edge. Right. It's a real way to look at it. You think life's about making sure nobody ever feels uncomfortable? That's not living, Kelly. That's pretending. The crowd oohed louder this time. The tension no longer something subtle in the background, but a living, breathing part of the room. Kelly's eyes glistened faintly, not from tears yet, but from the heat of someone feeling the sting, of words that hit closer than intended. Sometimes, she said, her voice tightening, it's not about comfort, it's about kindness. Tim's gaze didn't waver. And sometimes kindness is telling someone what they don't want to hear. That line landed with a heavy thud in the atmosphere, drawing another sharp murmur from the audience. The co-host opened his mouth, clearly ready to jump in, but the two were locked in too tightly to notice. Kelly's hands gripped her cue cards, the paper bending under her fingers. You know, she said, her voice rising slightly, I've been on the receiving end of words that were called truth, but were really just someone being mean, and it's not the same thing. Tim's tone softened slightly, but his words didn't. If you think I'm being mean, maybe you're not hearing me. You're hearing what you want to hear. That was the moment the air shifted entirely. The audience could feel it, the crew could feel it, and even Tim's jaw tensed like he knew they had crossed a line that couldn't be easily stepped back from. Asterisk. The silence that followed Tim's last statement was heavy enough to make the audience stop shifting in their seats. Us. Kelly's jaw tightened, her hands still gripping the cue cards. But now her eyes were locked on him in a way that told everyone, In the room, this had gone far beyond playful sparring. "You don't know what I've heard in my life," she said quietly, her voice catching just enough to hint at something deeper. "You don't know how many times someone's dressed up. Cruelty is honesty." The crowd murmured softly, the tone shifting from curiosity to unease. Tim's expression softened just slightly, but his reply came without hesitation. "I'm not those people, Kelly. And if you're putting me in that same box, maybe you're not being fair." Kelly blinked rapidly, her lashes catching the bright studio light, and for the first time her voice wavered. "It feels the same right now." A collective "oh" ran through the audience, and in that moment, it was clear they were watching something real, not rehearsed. Tim leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, his tone quieter but no less firm. "If you can't handle me." Speaking plain, then maybe he stopped mid-sentence, perhaps realizing where he was headed. But the half-formed thought hung in the air like a slap. Kelly exhaled shakily, her hand lifting just enough to swipe beneath one eye. The first tear didn't fully fall, but it was there, glistening under the lights, undeniable. The audience went silent except for a few uneasy murmurs, as if collectively unsure whether to clap, comfort, or just witness. The co-host shifted in his seat, ready to step in, but Kelly straightened, forcing a smile that trembled at the edges. "You know what?" she said, her voice breaking on the last syllable. "I think we need to go to break." The crew immediately sprang into motion, a stage manager signaling to the control room while the theme music swelled faintly in the background. Tim leaned back, watching her with an expression that was hard to read, part frustration, part something else. Kelly set her cue cards down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. And for a brief, piercing second, her eyes glistened openly as she looked out at the audience. It wasn't a meltdown, but it was raw enough that no one in the room could mistake it for anything other than genuine.